August 27, 1975, Menelik Palace, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. The smell of earth fills the air of the imperial bedroom. A pillow lies far from the bed. The face of the Lion of Judah, once the mighty symbol of Africa, has turned dark blue. Haile Selassie I, King of Kings, descendant of Solomon, revered as a god by the Rastafarians, has just been brutally murdered in his own bed. But that is not what the world believed for decades. How could a man who ruled for over 40 years, who survived invasions and played world powers against each other during the Cold War, end up assassinated by those he had sworn to protect? If you enjoy uncovering the darkest secrets behind Africa's greatest historical events, this video will reveal a truth that literally remained buried for 25 years. And I guarantee that what you're about to see and learn in the next few minutes will change everything you thought you knew about the fall of Africa's last emperor. Like the video, if you want me to keep unraveling these historical mysteries, because this story is just beginning. To understand this brutal downfall, we must first know who Haile Selassie really was at the height of his power. Imagine an African leader in the 1950s capable of playing the United States, the Soviet Union, and China, all at once. That was Selassie. In 1959, he was received with full honors in Moscow. Nikita Khrushchev promised him over $100 million in aid. Immediately after, he flew to China and met with Mao Zedong. The result was a masterstroke. Alarmed at the idea of losing influence in Africa, the Americans drastically increased their military aid. But Selassie wasn't just a brilliant politician. For millions of people, especially in Jamaica, he was literally a god on earth. The Rastafarians worshipped him as the King of Kings, prophesied in the Book of Revelation. When he visited Jamaica in 1966, crowds bowed before him as before a living deity. Yet while Selassie shone on the international stage, building his image as a visionary leader, a deadly storm was forming beneath his feet. 1962. A single decision would change the fate of millions and seal the end of the Ethiopian Empire. Against the advice of his counselors, Selassie dissolved the Ethiopian Eritrean Federation and annexed Eritrea as a mere province of Ethiopia. What seemed a smart political move to consolidate territory turned out to be the greatest mistake of his life. The reaction was explosive. Guerrilla movements erupted across Eritrea. The Eritrean Liberation Front declared total war on the Ethiopian government. But here's the detail few know. Selassie's own generals were divided on how to handle the crisis. The Governor-General, Ras Asrate Kassa, pursued a policy of benevolent neglect to avoid direct confrontation. Prime Minister Aklilu Habtewold demanded immediate martial law. Selassie kept changing his mind, creating administrative chaos that cost thousands of lives, and ultimately his throne. November 21, 1970. General Teshome Ergetu, military commander in Eritrea, was ambushed and killed by ELF forces. Selassie's response was to declare a state of emergency and appoint a new general for a war he no longer knew how to win. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, something even more dangerous was unfolding. 1968. Richard Nixon wins the U.S. elections, marking the end of the golden age of U.S.-Ethiopian relations. For decades, that alliance had rested on one pillar, Kagnu Station, a massive communications and intelligence base in Asmara covering 14 square kilometers. It was not just a military base. It was the nerve center of U.S. operations in the Red Sea during the Cold War. But satellite technology rendered it obsolete. In 1971, the U.S. cut military aid from $12 million to $10.8 million. In August 1973, Washington announced that Kagnu Station would close by the end of 1974. Selassie had been abandoned by his most powerful ally. At the very moment he needed them most. Between 1973 and 1974, something unprecedented happened. The Emperor of Ethiopia made 3 desperate trips to Washington, literally begging for military aid. Imagine the humiliation. A man treated as a king for decades, reduced to pleading for an audience with Richard Nixon. Even face-to-face talks with the American president couldn't change his fate. There was an urgent reason for his desperation. Siad Barre, the Soviet-backed leader of Somalia, was intensifying territorial claims in Ethiopia's Ogaden region. In the fall, in total despair, Selassie returned to Moscow. no longer the confident diplomat of the 1950s, but a broken man begging the Soviets to stop arming his enemies. The reception was icy. Leonid Brezhnev barely acknowledged his pleas. The Soviets had already chosen their horse in the region, and it wasn't Ethiopia. But while the emperor struggled abroad to save his empire, a far greater tragedy was destroying his country from within. 1972. A famine of catastrophic proportions ravaged the northern provinces of Tigray and Wallo. Hundreds of thousands of desperate refugees marched toward the capital, seeking help that never came. In Wallo alone, entire villages starved to death. When Selassie finally visited the devastated provinces and saw the horror with his own eyes, it was already too late. The damage was done. The people's trust in the King of Kings was shattered forever, and it was precisely this loss of faith that ignited a revolution that would change Africa forever. January 1974. Nagelbarina, a small town near the Kenyan border. A water pump breaks down. That broken pump would trigger the revolution that toppled one of the world's oldest empires. Officers of the 4th Army Division banned soldiers from using the officers' well. The soldiers rebelled, captured their commanders, and broadcast a radio message demanding better pay. Like wildfire, the rebellion spread. In the capital, taxi drivers went on strike, followed by students, then teachers. On February 25th, soldiers from the 2nd Infantry Division mutinied in Asmara, taking control of the regional capital. The imperial system was collapsing in real time. Fuel and raw material prices skyrocketed due to the global oil crisis. The streets of Addis Ababa turned into a battlefield. And amid this chaos emerged a dark force that would forever alter Ethiopia's destiny. The Derg, the Provisional Military Administrative Council. That was its official name, but people simply called it Derg, a word meaning committee in Amharic, a simple name to hide a terrifying reality. At first, no one really knew who they were. They operated in the shadows, without a clear political program, but quickly became the face of growing discontent in Ethiopia. By April 1974, mysterious pamphlets began circulating in Addis Ababa, signed only by elements of the armed forces. They demanded the arrest of former Prime Minister Aklilu Habtevold, ending with a sinister threat. If our demands are not met promptly, the army will take decisive action to enforce them. When Selassie refused to yield, the Derg acted. They marched straight into Jubilee Palace and arrested Aklilu in front of the emperor himself. Within days, the entire cabinet was detained. Hundreds of high-ranking political figures were imprisoned. 1974, National Palace, Addis Ababa. Members of the Derg entered the library, where Haile Selassie stood stoically waiting. There, he heard the proclamation that ended 3,000 years of Ethiopian monarchy. His Majesty Haile Selassie I is hereby relieved of his duties, effective immediately, and replaced by a provisional military government. The King of Kings was escorted out through a side door to the headquarters of the Army's 4th Division, where many of his former ministers were already imprisoned. But the emperor's fall was only the beginning of a bloodbath. Lieutenant General Aman Andam, nicknamed the Lion of the Desert, a respected military officer, became the first president of the Derg. Aman represented moderation, reconciliation, and negotiation. On the other side stood Colonel Mengistu Haile Mariam, younger, more radical, more ambitious, and infinitely more dangerous. November 17, 1974. Mengistu presents two non-negotiable demands to General Aman: more troops for an aggressive military campaign in Eritrea, and the execution, without trial, of the imprisoned imperial officers. Aman categorically refuses. He argues for a negotiated solution and refuses to condone extrajudicial killings. Mengistu then places him under house arrest. But Aman was not a man who surrendered without a fight. He withdrew to his residence with a small group of loyal followers. The next day, Derg forces surrounded his home. Through loudspeakers, the soldiers demanded his surrender. A single shot fired from inside was the answer. The ensuing gunfight ended with the death of Aman Andam and several of his supporters. That very night, inside Menelik Palace, something even more sinister took place. The names on Mengistu's death list were read aloud before members of the Derg. In a macabre scene, they voted by a show of hands to decide who would be executed. The initial list contained fewer names, By the end of the vote, it had grown to over 60. On November 23rd, the prisoners were transferred to Kircheli Prison, the central penitentiary of Addis Ababa. Under the cover of night, they were taken to the courtyard and lined up in pairs along the wall. Each pair was executed one after another. Their bodies were hastily buried in shallow pits, covered with bright, hot lights to accelerate decomposition. That bloody night was the prelude to an era of unprecedented terror in Ethiopia. Haile Selassie survived his former prime ministers and all those who perished in November 1974, but only for 9 more months. After several weeks of interrogation at the headquarters of the 4th Division, some personally overseen by Colonel Mengistu, the former emperor was brought back to Menelik Palace. From that moment on, he was surrounded by only a handful of servants. His butler, Mariam, remained by his side day and night. August 27, 1975, the night that would forever change Ethiopia's history. Here is the testimony of the emperor's own butler, Eshete. On the night of August 27, 1975, I saw Colonel Mengistu Haile Mariam walking down the corridor with another man, near the emperor's room. I was then ordered to move to a different room, but I was allowed to inform His Majesty of the decision. The next morning I returned to the imperial apartments to serve breakfast. The first thing I noticed was the strong smell of earth. I found the emperor lying motionless on his bed. His face had turned dark blue, and his pillow was beside his head instead of beneath it. Everything indicated that the emperor had been drugged and then suffocated in his sleep. The next day, the military council publicly announced that the former emperor had died following prostate surgery. But his personal physician, Professor Asrat Woldeyes, immediately challenged this claim. He revealed that the surgery had taken place several months earlier, and that until his final days, the emperor had been in perfect health. In one final act of disrespect, Haile Selassie was denied the dignity of a proper Christian burial. It was later revealed that Colonel Mengistu had ordered his body to be buried beneath the floor of a palace bathroom. These remains were not discovered and exhumed until after Mengistu's regime fell in 1991. On November 5th, 25 years after his death, Haile Selassie finally received a funeral worthy of his rank. Thus ended the story of the last emperor of Ethiopia, a man who dominated international politics for decades, who was worshipped as a deity, who survived invasions and crises, only to be betrayed and murdered by those who were meant to protect him. The truth about Haile Selassie's death remained hidden for decades, buried with his body beneath the palace floor. But stories like this remind us that beyond headlines and pompous ceremonies, history is made of human beings, with their ambitions, weaknesses, and fatal consequences. If, like me, you're fascinated by these stories that uncover the dark secrets behind Africa's greatest historical events, then subscribe, because we still have many moving stories from Africa to explore together. Until then, keep questioning, keep discovering, and remember, the real history is always more striking than any fiction. Dans un ultime acte d'irrespect, Sélassié se vit refuser la dignité d'un enterrement chrétien approprié. Il fut plus tard révélé que le colonel Mengistu avait ordonné de cacher son corps sous le plancher d'une salle de bain du palais. Ses restes ne furent découverts et exhumés qu'après la chute du régime de Mengistu en 1991. Le 5 novembre, 25 ans après sa mort, Haile Selassie reçut enfin des funérailles dignes de son rang. Ainsi s'achève l'histoire du dernier empereur d'Éthiopie, un homme qui domina la politique internationale pendant des décennies, qui fut vénéré comme une divinité, qui survécut aux invasions et aux crises, pour finalement être trahi et assassiné par ceux-là même qui devaient le protéger. La vérité sur la mort de Haile Selassie resta cachée pendant des décennies, enterré avec son corps sous le plancher d'une salle de bain. Mais des histoires comme celle-ci nous rappellent qu'au-delà des grands titres et des cérémonies pompeuses, l'histoire est faite d'êtres humains, avec leurs ambitions, leurs faiblesses et leurs conséquences mortelles. Et si, comme moi, ces récits qui révèlent les secrets sombres derrière les grands événements de l'histoire africaine te fascinent, alors aime cette vidéo. Abonne-toi à la chaîne, car nous avons encore beaucoup d'histoires bouleversantes d'Afrique à explorer ensemble. D'ici là, continue de questionner, de découvrir, et souviens-toi, la vraie histoire est toujours plus frappante que n'importe